Welcome back, Treksters! Today we're going to highlight what's hot and what's not about Enterprise on this edition of...
Yeah, it's the best five, worst five, know what I mean? Yeah, it's the best five, worst five Treks ever seen.
Star Trek Enterprise is an odd fellow in the franchise. It got off to a rocky start that turned off a lot of Trekkies, myself included, in its first run. Like many Trek series, though, it found its footing by the end of the second season, and was just getting great when cancelled after its fourth. As per the usual, we're starting with the fifth worst. Extinction. Despite Season 3 being where Enterprise first started to overall shine, 2 of its first 3 episodes aren't super great. While looking for any signs of the Xindi race that attacked Earth, the crew comes across a planet that nearly instantly transforms them into another race, hell-bent on finding their lost city. There's another race that comes here and wipes out those infected, though if they were so concerned with this transformation disease spreading, then why not, maybe leave a warning buoy in orbit? While the general premise feels like a classic TOS script, finding the deeper meaning of a lost civilization, neither the writing nor the acting are up to par here. Number 4. Desert Crossing. I'm not sure how an episode that includes one of my favorite actors, Clancy Brown, could be a bad episode, but it very much is. Not because of Clancy, but for a script that quite literally goes nowhere. As Enterprise often does, this episode is one of many analogies to the War on Terror and 9/11. Enterprise unknowingly offers passage to Osama bin Laden, and when they get there, play in the sand for a while. Though when they realize they've helped a not-so-great guy, Archer and Trip go and hide in the desert because. Even though it's this guy who helps find them because he has a code of honor.
A code of honor protects one, Captain, like a magic cloak.
There's nothing more boring than meandering through the desert. Number 3. Voxala. This episode actually has a classic Trek plot of helping a new life get back to where it's supposed to be. The thing is, the life form is a web of space, and it proceeds to pull Archer, Trip, and crewman Redshirt into it. Hoshi actually gets to be awesome here, but it doesn't offset just how grossly uninteresting the rest of the episode is, including our first of 2 meetings with the Cretaceans. An easily incensed race that the growing Federation should probably just avoid at all costs due to literally everything offending them. This episode may not have been so bad if it weren't tied to the second meeting with this race. Number 2. These are the Voyages. This infamously bad final episode of the series that will probably never be challenged as worst finale in Trek history. Usually, bringing in beloved former characters from a past Trek show would garner love from us in the fandom. But when these characters are more of the focus in the episode than the crew that you're saying goodbye to, it doesn't work so well. If this gimmick had been fused with a different single-episode script earlier in the season, this could have been a fun concept. However, this isn't even the episode's biggest problem. Unaliving one of the main characters for very little reason was a bad look. If that hadn't happened, this might have at least been slightly better than TOS's final episode, but still isn't a great story being told to begin with, at least till the end. The very end of the episode, mashing up the classic "These are the Voyages" moment, is actually one of the best final scenes in all of Trek's finales. And for this alone, it avoids the worst spot on the list. And here we are at the bottom of the barrel. Number 1. A Night in Sickbay. There is absolutely an episode worse than killing a main character and ruining all the goodwill built through a series. Big surprise, Archer offends the Cretaceans again. At least this time, the reason kind of makes sense when his dog Porthos urinates on one of their sacred trees. Turns out there was yet another reason Archer maybe shouldn't have taken his sausage with fur with him on an apology tour to an easily offended race, as the planet contains a deadly pathogen to canines. As the title suggests, this causes the bulk of the episode to be spent in sickbay with Phlox trying everything to save Porthos. In true Phlox fashion, he does some outside-the-box medical voodoo to get Archer's best friend back into shape. Apparently, that's not enough to fill a runtime, though. Phlox scraping his tongue and chasing his bat aren't exactly riveting television. What's also not great TV is Archer dealing with an affection for T'Pol through creepy wet dreams. If this was part of a larger plot through multiple episodes, it might not be as weird, but it ultimately goes nowhere. This episode threw every weird piece of writing at the wall and none of it stuck. As we take a shuttle pod over to the best of Enterprise, if you're enjoying the content, please consider a like and subscribe. At 5th best, Observer Effect. It only took 4 seasons to give Anthony Montgomery a chance to act, and both he and Dominic Keating knocked this episode out of the park as the primary hosts of 2 blasts from TOS past in The Return of the Organians. Using a virus that's incompatible with carbon-based life as a way to better understand how races of the Alpha Quadrant deal with hardship, they watch how different races treat their infected crew. While this is one of multiple episodes we have to watch Trip die in, it really pulls you in and feels like one of the most classically Trek episodes during the run of Enterprise. Number 4. Countdown. The penultimate episode of Season 3's Xindi arc is probably its best, and rightly so, it won an Emmy for visual effects. For me, that specifically includes one of the best space battles in cinema, showing what happens to the water inside an aquatic ship when it's destroyed in space really pushed the envelope of CGI fluid simulation for mid-2000s and holds up far better than a good chunk of computer-generated scenery in the show. This is one of the most non-stop action episodes across the franchise, and for a show that's usually a slower exploration of humanity through a sci-fi lens, is probably the best Trek ever does for an almost pure action episode. Number 3. Shockwave, Parts 1 and 2. Stop me if you've heard this one. Scott Bakula does a time travel plot. I've seen some say this is the worst 2-parter in Trek. And Encounter at Farpoint aside, I'm not sure how. There's a lot going on here and sets some precedent for how humans are going to boldly go in a highly variable universe when Archer and crew are accused of setting an atmosphere on fire and ending thousands of lives. As they find out, it wasn't their fault and Johnny gets trapped in a time paradox moment with Notkovich. There's a lot of action balanced out with some series arc moments that I personally think work really well, especially for humans' first deep space mission. Number 2. The Forge, Awakening, and Kirshara. Trek doesn't have a ton of 3-part episodes, but it may be the best in that category. We finally get to see the long-talked-about Vulcan Forge with its extreme conditions and terrifying sandstorm lightning as T'Pol goes on a pilgrimage to find her mom, who's seemingly joined a cult that hides in the Forge. Her and Archer don't realize the political situation they've stepped into, as one of the most negatively emotional Vulcans in the highest office on the planet is hell-bent on wiping out the Sirenites. We've heard a lot about Serac over the course of the franchise, as basically this world's logical Jesus that helped pull the Vulcans out of their illogical, destructive ways. And Archer accidentally ends up the host of his eternal soul. Taking up the task of finding the Holy Grail, they're able to foil V'Las's plan, and this really helps make sense of why Vulcans of this era seem so arrogant versus the more compassionate ones we're used to in centuries to come. Robert Foxworth's second portrayal of a power-hungry leader in the franchise is spectacular, and meeting a young T'Pau is also a treat. All 3 episodes of this story are well used without a hint of filler, and ties in so many great pieces of Trek canon for us to muddle over. And the best episode of Enterprise at number 1? Dawn. I know this isn't even on most people's radar, but I've got to say it's got all the makings of a great Star Trek episode. This is even the origin of the Picard showrunner's namesake planet, Metalis Prime. Despite being generally flawed, the middle of Season 2 has a string of really decent episodes, with this being the best. It takes all the best story pieces of TNG's Darmok and leaves its forced nature and annoying language of stories on the table. Trip's encounter with a hostile alien who's in the same predicament as he is, but neither has a universal translator, feels like a realistic situation that might happen to Starfleet officers from time to time. Each learn some of the other's language and go from mortal enemies to reluctant friends by the end. And if that's not the most Trek message I've ever heard, I don't know what is. What's your favorite episode of Enterprise?